This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
Every week we talk about books and research and other things that we find fascinating and topical. As always, you can of course support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and becoming a Patreon. A little goes a long way for us. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany will be holding the EU presidency of the second half of 2020, and with their generous support, the Tel Aviv Review will be holding a series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and the European countries.
And to this end, we are happy to host our guest today, who is Dr. Maya Sion Tzidkiyahu. She's an adjunct lecturer at the European Studies Graduate Program of the European Forum at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the EU Studies Program at Tel Aviv University. She's also co-president of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration and the director of the Program on Israel-Europe Relations at the Mitvim Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. We'll be discussing her paper entitled European Parliament and Israeli Elections, What Impact and Effect on EU-Israeli Relations. It was presented at the IEPN annual conference in July last year in Brussels, and other works as well of hers and the broader themes in general. Dr. Maya Sion Tzidkiyahu, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, nice to be with you.
So let's start by, a general question perhaps a dumb question, who knows?
No dumb questions, Gilad.
Who, compared to other non-member states, on a scale of 1 to 10, how healthy would you say is the relationship between Israel and the EU?
Okay, so like a good Israeli or perhaps a Jew person, your question can be answered in two different answers. And we should divide the relations between Israel and the European Union to two parts, very general ones. The economic ones are doing very well. We are, the European Union is the major trading partner of Israel, and this is really very important part of Israel's economy. But on the political side, from a historical perspective, we have known many ups and downs. And during the last decade, we have seen quite a downturn in Israeli-EU relations. It's quite a serious one, and I guess that we can elaborate further when we talk about it.
Yeah, let's start by going a little bit further back. Tell us something about the history of the relationship between Israel and the EU in its earliest days, when it was first formed in the 1950s, based on trade associations. What can you tell us about how that relationship has evolved? What did these different entities want from one another?
So I think it's important maybe to begin by understanding that both Israel and the European Union are sort of miracles and very interesting and fascinating entities created as a result of World War II. So Israel, I guess, would not have been founded without the Shoah and World War II. But also the European Union is a direct creation of the antagonism and the fear and the great hatred between Germany and France. And this was actually the solution to the German problem in the midst of Europe. But even though that both those entities were created by the experiences of World War II, they took it to very, very dissimilar positions. So while Israel is very much a national state and has, created itself as a new national Jewish state, the European Union has tried to create itself as a supranational state, actually tried to decrease nationalism, maybe to get rid of the negative byeffects that nationalism had in the European continent. While Israel tried very much to build its army, what the European Union built was a very much lasting peace system. So Israel, maybe not by choice, but had to act in a very military way towards its neighbors And the European Union maybe took the lessons from the past and changed itself dramatically from a continent of 2,000 years of wars to a continent of peace, and built a lasting peace system. So I think it's really interesting to look at those two entities and see how different they are, while both are founded on democratic principles, on the rule of law, on the attempt to build themselves also on the respect for human rights and civil rights. So they have common basis, and they have very different also outlooks.
Are these major differences that you're describing, are they what accounts for the acrimonious relationship that you were touching upon earlier?
Acrimonious, that's a big word. I think Maya used the word in your paper that the relationships are in the doldrums now, or stagnant. Which is it? Are these relations really in such a bad way right now? Are they acrimonious, or are they just stuck?
It depends on the period where you look, but in the last decades, I would use those terms. So they are in the doldrums at the very highest political level, meaning the prime minister in Israel, the foreign minister, if we had one, or one if we have one. They do not.
If we ever have one, yeah.
Hopefully we'll have one, but we didn't have such an active foreign minister until recently. And the prime minister itself took the position, and in the last decade, whether we had a foreign minister or not, we almost stopped meeting one another. So in that sense, the highest level of political relations are in the doldrum. They are acrimonious to some extent, again, when we are talking about the peace process, about the political issues that had to do with that, with the linkage policy that the EU established, a link between how further Israel and the Palestinians are advancing in their peace process, and if there is advancements in this peace process, then the EU can advance its relations with Israel. So the EU created this linkage policy that has actually made the Israeli-EU relations stop.
But now I want to restate Gilad's question, because I kind of overshadowed it, but it's an important question. Do you think that this linkage policy, which is a form of tension between the two, do its roots go back to the differences that you described?
To some extent, yes. If we look at the European Union as a system of peace, and this is one of its main values, that it would like to reinforce as much as possible outside of the EU, then I think this is the aspiration of the European Union, to also see peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And to that extent, I think it is willing to go to quite a far extent with its relations with Israel, and to put it under the Palestinian-Israeli peace process.
But I'd like to ask you conversely, perhaps as a devil's advocate here, if about the linkage policy that really prevents the EU from deepening its relations with Israel until a breakthrough or some sort of progress is reached in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. If the EU is already Israel's biggest trade partner, what interest is there? What incentive is there for Israel to follow up on the linkage policy? If there's no sticks here, just carrots. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but I know this is the second time I'm piling on to Gilad's question, but I think to help people, or to help me understand that question, can you give us some of the background to the other side of Israel-EU relationships and what's going well? Because there is a parallel track that seems to be going swimmingly, and that's the economic track and the trade track, which you mentioned briefly, but maybe you can expand on why we're in the situation where the two tracks aren't totally aligned. And then we will be able to get to this devil's advocate.
Excellent.
Quandary.
Let me take us away a little bit back from a historical perspective and sort of review the relations. We can review already more than 60 years of trade between Israel and the European community. So before there was a European Union, there was a European Community. And Israel was actually the third country in the world to recognize this special entity, the European Community. And from the beginning, Israel, the Israeli government, wanted trade relations, very advanced trade relations with the European Community. And the European community was very reluctant to give those advanced relationship to Israel. So Israel asked for an association agreement, and the European community was not willing to give this status to Israel until 1995. So 30 or 40 years later.
That was for political reasons, or just because Israel wasn't ready yet, sort of in its infrastructure of the economy?
I think that the European community was not willing so much to give. That was one of the highest status that the European community could give a foreign country, and it was preserved for the closest neighborhoods, for the closest countries to the European community. So it was not willing so much to give it very willingly to other countries that are further away, not in Europe, etc. So at the beginning, for example, Greece received the association status, but Israel had to wait quite a lot of years until it received it. And that was only in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So what did happen that Israel did sign economic treaty with the European community at the 60s. It was very insignificant. The most significant economic agreement that Israel signed was in 1975. That was a free trade agreement. And then there was a period of that nothing happened until 1995, where Israel signed the association agreement. Now, what is an association agreement? It includes a much more advanced free trade agreement and many other items on the agreement that can open negotiations on different policy fields. So it can open negotiations on advancing the service negotiations between Israel and the European Union. It has a political dialogue article within it, establishing a regular annual political dialogue at the highest levels of the European Union and Israel at ministerial level. It has subcommittees. It has many, many options within it that Israel and the European Union can advance their relations. So it's not just an economic agreement. And that is still the most advanced treaty that Israel and the European Union has signed. Now it is more than 30 years old, right? We would have expected something new by now. It's not the last agreement that Israel signed with the European Union.
Yeah, tell us about some of the more recent ones.
Exactly. So one of the things that I have to make some links between the economic advancement and the political situation in the area. So when the Oslo process goes on and there are agreements being signed with the Palestinian Authority, then the European Union opens its gates to Israel. And this is the background for the signing of the association agreement. And that's also the opening for Israel, for example, to join the research program being dealt by the European Union, which is the biggest research program in the world.
Is that Horizon 2020?
Now we call it Horizon 2020, which is about to end this year in 2020. And in 2021, it is about to be called Horizon Europe. So from 96 already, for more than 20 years now, Israel has been part of this research program. And every 7 years or so, it renews its membership in the research program of the European Union and has made a lot of advancement and has made a lot of gains, research gains, partnerships, knowledge, research bases, datas, and a lot of other issues by this agreement. And it was the first non-European country to be included in the research program of the European Union. So that was a major achievement of Israel. And those are the high days of the 90s, where Israel-European relations really make a good progress. And I think it's a win-win situation, right? When the European Union gains the Israeli sort of beginning of the startup nation technologies and advancement. And Israel is gaining access to many facilities of research in the European Union.
Okay, so let's go back to my question that perhaps jumped the gun. It sounds like a very sweet deal. So really, what's really Israel losing from the implementation of the linkage policy? Of what has been prevented from Israel due to that?
So what has been prevented is actually advancing the relations further.
What, for example?
So I'm getting in there. The association agreement is more than 30 years old. We can renew it. Nowadays, the European Union signs partnership priorities agreements. It signs deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. It signs different trade agreements and not only trade agreements, it's sort of mixed agreements with other countries. It signed a few years ago a very advanced trade agreement with Canada, for example. But Israel is not able to advance any sort of negotiation on a new agreement with the European Union, I would say, since 2013. So we have signed, until 2013, we have signed new agreements, and that is the Open Skies Agreement, for example. Israel has made a lot of advantage in tourism, especially the outgoing tourism from Israel to Europe by signing this Open Skies Agreement.
I want to just jump in and say that has put money in the pocket of every Israeli who can travel abroad at much more reasonable expense.
Absolutely. And think about, also the added value of the image of Europe. Once you've toured Europe and you've tasted it and you want to go back and, you're having a good time in Europe. So that's also a good image of Europe in the Israelis' minds.
And what about the cross-border cooperation agreement of December 2017? Can you tell us about that?
This is actually a very small agreement. It's not very significant. It has a few million euros, I think about 80 million euros, to advance this cooperation. But it's not as significant.
Okay, but the point is there have been other kinds of small agreements signed in recent years. Israel has the basic agreement. It may not have updated it, but the EU is still a massive trading partner. I want to go back to the question of the linkage policy that Gilad has been trying to get at. How is Israel actually suffering from this? And I will go further because you write in the paper that Israel sees the linkage policy as an unprecedented double standard. Can you tell us why Israel sees it that way? Maybe you also see it that way. Why is this a double standard? Which part of it is a double standard?
Well, if we compare the EU relations with Israel to the EU relations with other European neighborhood countries, and European neighborhood countries meaning the ones to the southern parts of the European Union, so you can start with Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, etc., going through Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, and going a bit to the north to Syria, which doesn't really have relations with the European Union, and to the eastern part of the European Union, so Ukraine and this region. And if all those countries, there are 16 countries in this European neighborhood policy that the EU created back in 2003 and 4. And if you compare the relations between the EU and those countries to what Israel has achieved, you would see that, for example, EU and Morocco are negotiating partnership priorities. They are negotiating a deep and comprehensive free trade area. This is not going on with Israel. Now, Israel is the most advanced economic country of those 16 countries. It is a democratic, established democratic country that has a rule of law. It has many advantages. And of course, it has the political conflict with the Palestinians and the occupation status. Okay, but if you take Morocco, for example, Morocco also has an occupation status with regards to Western Sahara. And it goes back to 1979, if I remember correctly. Okay?
No, 1975-6, but that's okay. Close enough.
Yeah, okay. Now, if you compare Israel and Morocco in those two senses, two countries, one is democratic, very economically advanced, and the other one is not democratic, less economically advanced, but both are occupying countries. The EU is treating Israel very differently than it treats Morocco. There is no linkage policy to Morocco. There is hardly any differentiation policy with Morocco. So why is the European Union treating Israel differently than it's treating other countries that are internationally, by international law, they are being considered as occupying countries?
But I want to point out that in the paper, you yourself wrote that the European Court of Justice has issued 2 separate rulings against Morocco because of Western Sahara, saying that there are territorial restrictions on all EU agreements with Morocco for that very reason. The UK has also had similar legal debates. So why, but then you say that that's an example of the double standard. So I was not clear on that. It seems like that's a judgment against Morocco. So the very same, in a very similar way to the differentiation policy.
So first, to begin with, it's a really good question. First, to begin with the Brita ruling in 2010, that was the first ruling of the European Court of Justice dealing with the question of differentiation policy, whether the European Union should charge customs or have the products being exported from the Israeli occupied territories to the European Union, should it charge customs or not charge customs? Because if we have a free trade agreement, then where does this agreement apply? Does it apply only within Israel in the 67 border, or does it also include the occupied territories? Now, Israel thinks it includes the occupied territories. The European Union thinks, no, Israel is only within the 67 borders. So in that sense, products going out of the occupied territories should pay customs once they reach the European Union. And this was an issue between the European Union and Israel. This was not an issue between the European Union and Morocco, only until the judgment in the Brita case that said that Israel is the occupied territory products made by in Israeli settlements has to pay customs. Then it was the Polisario movement in Morocco itself that went to the European Court of Justice to have the same treatment applied to Morocco.
And they got it.
And they got it to some extent, not to a full extent. So the European Court of Justice justified its position differently in the Moroccan case. And we're not going to go into the details because it's really,
No, it gets very esoteric. But I do think that there's, if you zoom out...
They did give Morocco a different treatment. And the Western Sahara were given a different treatment. So there is, until now, the gap is narrowed, but there is still some double treatment.
Right. But again, zooming out, I don't want to get into every single crazy detail, and trust me, there are lots of them. But if you zoom out and you look at another country that we didn't mention, which is also very close to the European zone and physically closer, Serbia, they also face a conditionality policy on the part of the EU in their more advanced EU negotiations, which is that they have to move ahead on advancing conflict resolution with Kosovo. Now, again, their situation is different, but in a broader sense, don't we see a consistency ultimately of the EU saying, if you want to be closer to our zone, you have to advance our values of peace, which you said was one of the roots of the establishment of the EU?
Yes, you can say that. You can say that there is some sort of a line, and you can also go to the case of Russia and Ukraine, and the Crimea region. So, and there you have sanctions from the EU on Russia because of 2014 invasion to the Crimea region. So, absolutely. We are definitely in the midst of the spectrum of the options that the European Union can have and can apply to third countries. But I think here Israel has all the time felt that the European Union is putting a lot of emphasis during the European Parliament discussions in the Foreign Affairs Committee, for example, during the Foreign Affairs Council of Ministers meetings, at least until a decade ago. And I remember friends, Israeli diplomats, friends in Brussels saying, I don't understand how come they talk about Israeli-Palestinian conflict for 80% of the time of some of the meetings. We have many conflicts in the Middle East, and this is not equal, not getting equal treatment.
But still, Maya, the question about the linkage policy here, I think there's a broader question that deserves to be asked, is that I'm guessing that the reason for the linkage policy is to apply pressure, to use it as a leverage on Israel to advance the peace process, right? And but the result is the opposite, right? It's been stymieing any sort of deepening of the relations between the EU and Israel, rather than doing the opposite. And maybe it also leads me to even a broader question, which is, why has the EU been so ineffectual in playing a major role diplomatically, not just between the Israelis and Palestinians, but for Israel in general, especially in relation compared to the United States and even other countries like Russia?
So there are actually two questions here that I would like to address. And the first one is that I would like also to stress that since 2013, there is no association council meeting between Israel and the European Union. So while the association agreement from 1995 established a political dialogue, and there was in the treaty, there is an article saying that the ministers should meet once a year, and they have met until 2012. They have met regularly. In 2013, because of a different decision of the European Union that we haven't discussed so far, the guidelines, Israel decided it doesn't want to meet the European Union. I mean, it doesn't want to hold an association council. And since 2013, we didn't have any association council. And now that has actually become the EU decision not to renew association council. So it's not Israel's decision. While with Morocco or with other countries, it still maintains this association council meetings. So there is political dialogue in the highest levels between the European Union and the rest of the countries, the neighborhood countries, and it doesn't exist with Israel. So that is a shame. Now, with regards to the European Union,
why has the EU been so unable to play a more active role in diplomatically?
And especially on the peace process, I would say. Has any of this had the intended effect of helping Israel get back to a peace process? And if not, why not?
So first, the European Union is not a significant partner in the peace process between the Israeli and the Palestinians once we had it, such a process, because Israel doesn't want it to play a role, because for a very long time, and I'm talking about decades, and it's at least from the 1980s and even beforehand, that Israel sees the European Union as a biased player, which is pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli, maybe not anti-Israeli, but definitely much more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israel.
And is that true, or is that just an image? Where did it start? I mean, you said in the 1980s, but why?
It started in 1980 specifically because of the Venice Declaration. Now,
tell us what the Venice Declaration. Yeah,
the Venice Declaration is. Let me just give one paragraph before the Venice Declaration, because we have to look at the European Union and what it is. So the European Union, began as a coal and steel community. It developed into a single market, and then in the 1970s, we have an interesting development where the member states are trying to establish a political cooperation. Okay? And this political cooperation is dealing with foreign policy issues. If the member states, and there are 9 member states at the 70s, including the United Kingdom, Denmark, and Ireland, if those countries can agree on a common position, then they have a common policy, a foreign policy. And one of their major successes since the 1970s is to reach such common position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the 1980 Venice Declaration is one of the major, phrasing of the policy of the European Union to the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. And this has gone throughout the years. This is more than 40 years later that we are still hearing the European Union repeating the Venice Declaration, meaning 2 states for 2 people.
So the European Union, such as it was, declared their support for 2 states for 2 people in 1980.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's
today,
groundbreaking for the Israeli
obvious.
ears. It's at a time when nobody in Israel was talking about two states. And I can tell you from public opinion survey.
Not talking about
Sure. And public opinion, the idea of a Palestinian state next to Israel was practically anathema. I've seen the surveys from that time. We're talking about, at probably 80 to 90% against it.
Exactly.
It wasn't even really even tested in that way. So this is quite radical to Israeli ears at the time.
Exactly. So the reaction by Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, to the Venice Declaration was extremely harsh. Really, he was repeating words like Europe back in the days of the SS, so Nazis references, and really harsh diplomatic reaction to the Venice Declaration by Menachem Begin. And I think since then, the public image of the European Union in Israel has been negative. As a biased, very pro-Palestinian entity that actually, advanced a solution that was not on the table. It was not on the international table to a great extent.
Okay, but now it is. So why hasn't that image changed? Because now it is, and it has been since the 1990s, roughly, let's say officially from the year 2000. Why has the image of the European Union not kind of improved in Israel, given that paradigm, that original sin, has become much more accepted?
I would say that it has improved in the 1990s, when this was the state of opinion in Israel as well. When the peace process was advancing, when there still is a majority nowadays in Israel for a two-state solution, but it's much less talked about. So in the 1990s, the image of the European Union in Israel was much more positive than it is today. And I was quite amazed actually to see in the Mitvim Institute annual poll of foreign policy, in 2019, only 27% of Israelis thought that the European Union is a friend. 45% of Israelis thought it was a foe. Now, that was a major improvement from the 2018 poll, where only 18% of Israelis thought the EU is a friend, and 55% of Israelis thought the EU is a foe. And that was quite a shock for me to discover those numbers.
Maya, I want to ask you maybe a different, looking at it from a different angle. Maybe this situation, which is clearly in shambles, to what extent does it derive from structural issues, from the fact that the European Union is like a semi-federation of rather independent nation states, each enacting its own foreign policy, whereas the trade policy is perhaps more centralized and more easily centralized than the foreign policy. Maybe that accounts for the great discrepancy between the two?
Might even be a kind of a confederation. Just have to put that in there.
It's definitely not a confederation, but it's neither a federation. The EU is much more than an international organization. It's a supranational organization, but it's much less than a state from any kind of a state. It's a federal or confederal, and there is no confederal state today. But if we're going back to the trade agreement, this is an area, and one of the very few areas where the European Union have exclusive competence in making those trade agreements. So if Israel wants to sign a new trading agreement, it cannot negotiate it with France or with Germany bilaterally. No, it has to go to the European Commission, and that has to gain the approval of 27 member states. I would say that there is a linkage between how warm the political atmosphere between Israel and the EU and how further our economic relations can advance on the legal sense.
Okay? Maybe I would say, even I'd like to propose to you that maybe the economic side is so advanced and the diplomatic side not so much, because essentially the EU is an economic body and less so a political one.
I think it's more of a historical development. So the main argument I would advance is that when the political relations are good, then the economic relations are advancing. And then Israel can take this advanced legal treaty that it has, for example, the association agreement, and build on it further on for a few more years, even sometimes a couple of decades. But when the political relations are deteriorating, as we are now today, we don't have the political will to advance to a much more advanced economic agreement.
Okay, but I want to just try to I want to jump in specifically on that point. Why is the direction of influence not the opposite? In other words, if you say that the economic relations advance, whenever the political relations go in a more, unified direction towards peace, why has that not acted as an incentive on Israel to say we could advance wonderful economic relations? They could be even better. We could have great relations with the Western countries. And you've pointed out that there's kind of a bipolarity to Israel's attitude towards Europe. We kind of resent them, but Israel also sort of worships Europe on some level, on a cultural level. Mm-hmm. Why has that not acted as an incentive for Israel to say, let's move ahead and get this peace agreement over with? We, for years we used to say we all know what the solution is. We just need to get there. I'm not sure if that's still the case. But why do you think that direction of influence hasn't really borne out? And we're going to have to try to use this as the wrap-up question.
I think first, we need two to tango. Israel has, I think, offered a lot on the table vis-a-vis the Palestinians. It was the Palestinians who declined. So perhaps we could have been in a different situations if the Palestinian leadership would have, taken the agreement that Israel offered it several times. And then everything would have been different in this region. So it's not only Israel that we need to look at. It's also the Palestinians. Other than that, Israel does not want the European Union to be a major player in the peace process itself. Again, going back to this bias of this pro-Palestinian bias. Israel trusts much more the United States. And this goes to the historical, maybe cognitive dissonance between Israelis and especially, of course, the Jews in Israel towards Europe. So there's a love-hate relationship going on, and it's nothing similar to any relations that we have with any other continent. It's Europe the glorious, and it's Europe the accursed, right? So I think the level of feelings that we have whenever we hear, as Israelis and Israeli Jews, whenever we hear any criticism by the European Union regarding to Israel, this is much more sensitive. This touches us in a much more sensitive place, historically speaking, than any other criticism that we will hear that we would take on its face value.
Oh, so in a way,
the United States or other countries.
You're saying in a way because Israel also looks up to Europe, so we take it more sensitively when we have this political criticism?
To some extent, but I think this is much more the place where we treat Europe as Europe the cursed, right? The Holocaust, the pogroms.
So it's basically like, give us your trade, check your politics at the door. Maya Sion, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for hosting us.
And thank you to Itai Shelem and to Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and to the German government for their generous support for this series. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write us a review. We like all kinds, supportive, critical, outrage. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.